It was a cold November evening when the silence of my apartment became deafening. I had always loved my solitude, loved the quiet moments where I could curl up with a book, sip my tea, and let the world fall away. But tonight was different. Tonight, the silence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. My name is Selin, and I live alone in a modest, two-bedroom flat on the outskirts of Istanbul. My building isn't grand, but it's comfortable, a safe haven in a bustling city. Or at least, it used to be. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows swallowed my living room, I felt my sanctuary shift into something unrecognizable. I sat on the couch, staring at the muted television. A sitcom flickered on the screen, its canned laughter jarring against the oppressive silence around me. My tea had gone cold on the coffee table, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound punctuating the stillness. Then it happened. A faint tap at the window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My flat was on the third floor, and the thought of someone, or something, tapping at my window made my stomach churn. Slowly, I turned my head toward the source of the sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see their slight movement, as if disturbed by a breeze. "Get a grip, Selin," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded thin and unconvincing. Perhaps it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I got up from the couch, my bare feet sinking into the soft rug. Each step toward the window felt heavier than the last, as if some unseen force was urging me to turn back. When I reached the curtain, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out to pull it aside. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood outside, cloaked in darkness. I could only make out the silhouette, a tall, broad shape, and the faint gleam of eyes staring back at me. How could they be there? How could they possibly be standing on the ledge of a third-floor window? My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. The figure didn't move, but the weight of its gaze pinned me in place. My mind raced with questions and scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. I fumbled for my phone, which was sitting on the coffee table. My hands shook as I unlocked it and dialed the police. "There's someone at my window," I whispered into the phone, barely able to form the words. The operator's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Help is on the way." "Are you in immediate danger?" "I don't know," I replied, glancing back at the window. The figure was gone. The relief was fleeting. If they weren't there, where had they gone? I moved to the door, checking the locks. The chain was secure, and the deadbolt was in place, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I stayed on the phone with the operator until the police arrived, a pair of officers who swept through my apartment and the building's perimeter. "There's no sign of anyone," one of them said, his tone reassuring but skeptical. "Are you sure you saw someone?" the other asked, his flashlight sweeping across my balcony. "Yes," I insisted, though doubt was beginning to creep in. Had I imagined it? The officers left shortly after, advising me to call again if anything else happened. I locked the door behind them and slumped against it, my heart still racing. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the building set my nerves on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching. I wish I could tell you that things got better after the note. That I managed to sleep, to eat, to think about something other than the creeping dread that gnawed at me every moment of the day. But that's not what happened. I don't know what it was, whether it was the cold look in the eyes of the officer who had found no trace of an intruder, or the voice of my neighbor downstairs who had asked me, with an unsettling kind of curiosity, if anything strange had happened to me lately. Maybe it was that damn note that refused to leave my mind. But from the moment I read those words, "I'm watching you," my apartment no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt like a trap. And I was its prey. I tried to keep my routine, as normal as I could. I went to work, went out for coffee, even met my friend Elif for dinner at the usual place. But every time I walked into that apartment, my gut twisted with the certainty that I was not alone. That someone had been there, waiting for me to return. There were no more notes. But that didn't mean the silence had become easier to bear. That Monday evening, I walked into my apartment like I had 100 times before. But tonight felt different. The air was thicker, charged with an invisible tension that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A faint, metallic scent, like copper, filled the air. I paused in the doorway, instinctively sniffing the air as if trying to make sense of it. But the odor was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only a lingering taste of fear at the back of my throat. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, more cautiously than usual. I didn't turn on the lights at first. Instead, I stood there in the dark, listening. For what? For any sign of movement. There was nothing. Just the silence. The kind of silence that becomes too loud when you've been alone for far too long. I forced myself to breathe deeply. I was being irrational, I knew it. But then, thud. A sound, sharp and jarring, coming from the back of the apartment. The kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and my skin crawled. I froze. My breath hitched in my chest. My first thought was that it was just the wind, maybe the fridge door had swung open on its own, or a loose dish had fallen. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't alone. I turned toward the sound, my body moving instinctively as I padded toward the kitchen, each step feeling like a betrayal of my own fear. The kitchen was just as I left it. The sink piled with dishes, the counter covered with the remnants of my earlier breakfast, nothing out of place. And then I saw it. The knife. A sharp kitchen knife, the one I used to slice fruit for breakfast every morning, was lying on the counter. It wasn't there before. It hadn't been when I left. And there was a stain on its blade. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the knife, but it felt like an eternity. My mind spun, and my legs trembled beneath me. How did it get there? Who had put it there? And why? But before I could reach out and touch it, I heard a noise, a soft shuffle behind me. A breath, barely audible, like someone was standing right there, watching me. I whirled around, but there was no one. Just the empty kitchen. Empty, save for the knife. I didn't even try to make sense of it. I just ran. I ran to the living room, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. My phone was already in my hand, and I dialed Elif's number without thinking. It went to voicemail. I slammed the phone down on the coffee table and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was in the apartment with me. That the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Watching. The next day, I went to work, forcing myself to put on a smile for my colleagues. But my mind kept racing, replaying the scene in my apartment. The knife. The stain. The figure that had stood behind me, invisible but undeniable. I told Elif about it over lunch, not wanting to sound crazy, but needing someone to hear me. She listened intently, her eyes wide with concern, but there was something about her expression that made me uneasy. "You're just stressed, Selin," she said, pushing her salad around with her fork. "You've been through a lot lately. Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That evening, when I returned home, I felt the familiar weight of dread settle over me as I stood in front of the door. It was locked. Of course, it was locked. But somehow, it didn't feel like enough anymore. I hesitated before entering. Something was off. I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I pushed open the door. The silence hit me first, thick, suffocating. But there was something else. A change in the air. A chill that had not been there before. I stepped inside cautiously, my senses on high alert. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow moving, just out of view. I turned my head so quickly that I almost gave myself whiplash. But again, there was nothing. And yet, I knew something was wrong. Something had shifted. I reached for my phone to call Alif. Again, I felt the need for someone to talk me down, but it wasn't there. It wasn't on the coffee table. It wasn't in my purse. I felt the panic rise in my chest as I searched frantically, every corner of the apartment suddenly unfamiliar. And then, there it was, resting on the kitchen counter, just beyond the knife. My phone. I approached it slowly, my footsteps deliberate. When I picked it up, the screen was cracked, the display distorted. But it wasn't the damage that unsettled me. It was the message. A single notification, from an unknown number. "I'm closer than you think." Over the next few days, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I went to work, met friends for coffee, and tried to convince myself that the figure at my window was a figment of my imagination. But the unease lingered, like a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. Then came the second incident. It was a Friday night, and I had just returned from dinner with a friend. The air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I walked up to my building. I took the stairs, as usual, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. When I reached my floor, I noticed something strange. The door to my apartment was ajar. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Pushing the door open cautiously, I stepped inside. The living room looked untouched, no signs of a struggle or forced entry. But as I moved further in, I noticed small, unsettling details. My tea mug, which I had left in the sink that morning, was now on the coffee table. The throw blanket on the couch had been folded neatly, something I never did. Someone had been here. My hands trembled as I dialed the police again. This time, the officers were less patient. They did another sweep, found no signs of forced entry, and suggested that I might have left the door unlocked. But I knew better. I spent the weekend at a friend's place, too afraid to return home. When I finally mustered the courage to go back, I found a note on my kitchen counter. It was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. On it, written in precise, almost delicate handwriting, were the words, "I'm watching you." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the note with trembling hands and called the police for the third time in as many days. This time, they took me seriously. An investigation was launched, but there were no leads. No fingerprints, no signs of a break-in, nothing. It was as if the intruder had slipped in and out of my life like a ghost. But I knew they weren't gone. The note was just the beginning. To be continued. The air in the apartment grew thick with an almost palpable tension. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My hand, still holding the phone, trembled uncontrollably as I stared at the message. It was like something in my head snapped. My mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, but my body instinctively began to act on pure fear. I'm closer than you think. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't just some sick prank. The words clung to the very air around me like a curse. Whoever this was, this presence, this shadow, they weren't just toying with me. They were playing a game, and I was the prize. I dropped the phone on the kitchen counter, the glass shattering as it hit. But even that sound felt distant, muffled by the overwhelming weight of dread pressing in from all sides. I could feel it in my bones, a cold that reached deep into my marrow. Someone, was there. Close. So close, I could almost feel their breath on the back of my neck. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't safe here. This wasn't a case of someone messing with me. Whoever was behind all of this had been in my apartment before. Had been watching me long before I even noticed. They had made their move, and now, they were closing in. I needed to leave. But that thought, that fleeting moment of clarity, was immediately drowned by another wave of fear. As soon as I turned to leave the kitchen, I heard a soft sound, a quiet scraping noise. Like fingers dragging across the floor, ever so gently, from behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming into my chest, but there was nothing. Nothing but the stillness that had taken over my apartment once more. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, as though they were alive, watching me, waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape this suffocating presence. But my legs wouldn't move. My body felt like it was frozen in place, the terror locking me into the very space I wanted to flee from. Then, slowly, too slowly, I became aware of a sound. A soft, rhythmic thud. It came from above me. From the ceiling. I stared up at the shadowed corners, the darkened spots where the light couldn't quite reach. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Thud. 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 It was getting louder. Closer. Like footsteps, pacing above me, getting closer to the edge of the room. To me. For a moment, I thought I might faint. My vision blurred, and my legs wobbled beneath me, threatening to give out. But somehow, I found the strength to turn, to move toward the hallway, my mind screaming at me to get out. To leave. But as I stepped into the hallway, something stopped me. Something in the periphery of my vision. A figure. It wasn't a shadow, not exactly. It was darker than the rest of the room, but it was there, solid, standing just at the end of the corridor, out of direct view. I could feel its presence, as if it were an extension of the darkness itself. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breathing hitched painfully in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my feet were nailed to the floor. My breath caught in my throat. Then the figure moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. I blinked, and it was closer. Another step. And then, a hand. Long, pale fingers curled into the frame of the doorway, a slow, deliberate motion. And then, a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but cutting through the silence like a blade. You shouldn't have looked. I didn't have time to process the words before the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The air grew impossibly thick, suffocating me, until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. The shadows began to twist, to writhe and bend in unnatural ways, as if they had a life of their own. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that I was no longer alone. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The silence returned, just as heavy as before, but somehow, different. The fear still clung to me like a second skin, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I could feel the presence, hovering just beyond my reach. It was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, frozen in place. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I stared into the darkness, the whisper of that voice still echoing in my mind. You shouldn't have looked. The phone rang. I don't know why, but I answered it. It was a reflex, I suppose. Maybe I thought it was a leaf, checking up on me. But it wasn't a leaf. It was a voice I didn't recognize. Deep. Low. Familiar, in a way that made my stomach drop. Did you think you could escape, Selin? The words were slow, deliberate. There was no anger in them, only something far worse, amusement. I see you, the voice continued, its tone playful, like a cat toying with its prey. I've always seen you. Always watched. You can try to run, but I'll always be there. The line went dead before I could say a word. I dropped the phone. My hands were shaking so violently now that I could barely keep my grip on it. That was it. The final straw. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't. I ran. I don't remember if I grabbed my things or just left in a blind panic. I didn't care. I didn't even look back. I fled down the stairs of my building, running through the dark streets, away from everything. Away from the apartment that was no longer mine. Away from the nightmare that had followed me home. I don't know how long I walked, but I found myself standing outside a hotel, staring at the neon sign blinking faintly in the distance. It seemed like a safe place. A place where I could breathe again. But as I turned to go inside, I saw it. In the reflection of the hotel's glass doors. A figure standing just behind me, watching. Waiting. And it whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I told you, Selin. You can't run.